Emma sat on the wooden bench outside the dance studio, tying the ribbons of her ballet shoes. The air smelled of polished floors and faint perfume, a reminder of the countless hours she had spent practicing. She wasn't a star dancer like Olivia, her older cousin, but she loved ballet with all her heart. Every time she watched Olivia perform, she imagined herself in the spotlight, gliding across the stage with the audience holding their breath. But dreams were just dreams, and Emma knew her place, always in the background. That evening, as she walked home, she heard her mother's phone ringing in the kitchen. She set down her bag and reached for a glass of water when her mother gasped. Emma looked up, curious. Her mother's voice was calm, but something about her expression made Emma freeze. "Oh no, how did it happen?" There was a pause. Then her mother nodded. "I understand." "Yes, of course." She ended the call and turned to Emma with an unreadable expression. Emma's heart started beating faster. "What happened?" she asked. Her mother sighed. "Olivia sprained her ankle. She won't be able to perform at the family event tomorrow." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Olivia's performance was the highlight of the evening. The whole family had been talking about it for weeks. Without her, there would be no grand performance. She waited for her mother to continue, but when she did, Emma couldn't believe what she heard next. "They need a replacement," her mother said slowly. "I suggested you." Emma's glass nearly slipped from her hand. "Me?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Her mother nodded. "You know the routine. You've practiced it so many times." Emma's mind spun. She knew Olivia's routine because she had watched her cousin dance it 100 times. She had practiced it alone in her room, imagining what it would feel like to be the one on stage. But she had never actually performed in front of anyone. And now, at the biggest family event of the year, they expected her to take Olivia's place. Before Emma could process it, the living room door burst open, and Olivia limped inside, her face red with frustration. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Emma can't do my dance. She's not ready for this." Emma felt her stomach tighten. Olivia had always been confident, always the star. And now she was looking at Emma like she was a joke. The other family members followed behind, talking over each other. "Why not just cancel the performance?" someone said. "No," Olivia's mother insisted. "We can't cancel." "But Emma," she shook her head. "She's not experienced enough." Emma clenched her fists under the table. They weren't even giving her a chance. Her mother straightened her back. "Emma has talent. Just because she hasn't performed for you doesn't mean she can't." Olivia rolled her eyes. "Fine. Let her embarrass herself." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. A part of her wanted to refuse, to say that Olivia was right. But another part of her, the part that had dreamed of this moment, felt something different, a small spark of determination. Later that night, Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, but her thoughts were loud. This was her chance. A real chance. But what if she failed? What if they laughed at her? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had one night to prove herself, one night to prepare. Throwing off the blanket, she stood up and grabbed her ballet shoes. Quietly, she slipped out of her room and tiptoed to the small practice space in the basement. She turned on the music and took her position. The first steps were shaky, but she kept going. She danced through the fear, through the doubt, until all that was left was the music and the movement. This was her moment, and she was not going to waste it. "You said." The basement was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner. The air was cool against Emma's skin as she stretched her arms and took a deep breath. She knew she had only one night to prepare, and the pressure was suffocating. But she couldn't let fear stop her. Not this time. She placed her feet in position, pressing play on the music. The soft melody filled the room, wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. She had watched Olivia perform this routine so many times, memorizing every movement, every spin, every leap. But knowing the steps was different from performing them. Emma lifted her arms and took her first step. Her body moved stiffly at first, her muscles unsure, but she pushed through. With each movement, she imagined the audience, the whispers of doubt from her family. She imagined Olivia's smirk, her disbelief. The thought fueled her, pushing her harder. Her feet slid across the wooden floor as she executed a turn, but she lost balance and stumbled. Frustration burned inside her. She wasn't good enough. Maybe Olivia was right. Maybe she was just a background dancer, someone who didn't belong in the spotlight. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to stop. She took another deep breath, adjusted her posture, and tried again. This time, she focused not just on the steps, but on the feeling. She let the music guide her, allowed her body to flow with the rhythm. And suddenly, it felt different. The more she danced, the more confident she became. She repeated the routine over and over, correcting each mistake, adjusting each movement. Sweat dripped down her back, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. A soft knock interrupted her. She spun around, her breath heavy. It was Mia, her best friend. She stood at the door, arms crossed, watching her. "You're still up," Mia whispered, stepping inside. Emma wiped her forehead and nodded. "I have to get this right." Mia watched for a moment, then smiled. "You're amazing, you know that." Emma scoffed. "Tell that to my family." Mia walked closer and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Forget them. Do this for yourself." Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to believe that was enough. She wanted to dance for herself. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wanted to prove them wrong. She wanted them to see her. Mia squeezed her hand. "You've got this. Tomorrow, they won't know what hit them." Emma took a deep breath, looking at herself in the mirror. Tomorrow, everything would change, one way or another. "You said." Emma stood in the center of the stage, her chest rising and falling with each breath. The silence in the hall was deafening. She had expected claps, at least polite applause. Instead, she felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her. Her throat tightened. Had she done something wrong? The music was still playing, and she had to keep going. Shaking off the unease creeping up her spine, she took her next step. Her arms lifted gracefully, her feet slid across the polished floor, and she focused on the rhythm, letting it guide her. For a moment, the doubt in her head faded. This was what she loved. This was what she had worked for. She turned, her skirt twirling around her as she executed each move with precision. But in the front row, her family's reactions remained cold. Olivia sat with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Emma's aunt leaned in to whisper something to her mother, who frowned slightly. Her uncle shook his head, his lips pressed in a thin line. Emma caught snippets of hushed voices from the crowd. She shouldn't be up there. This isn't right. She's not Olivia. Emma's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay focused. She couldn't let their words shake her. She had come too far. She had trained all night. She had dreamed of this moment for years. She reached the most difficult part of the routine, a high spin followed by a delicate landing. Her heart pounded as she leaped into the air. Time seemed to slow. She imagined the applause that should have come, the pride she had longed to see in their eyes. But when she landed flawlessly, there was nothing. No cheers, no smiles. Instead, Olivia let out a quiet scoff, and her aunt's frown deepened. Emma felt something inside her crack. She had poured everything into this performance, and yet, it wasn't enough. Not for them. The music continued, but Emma felt numb. She kept dancing, but it was no longer for them. It was for herself. If they couldn't see her talent, if they refused to accept her, then maybe they never would. But she wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. "You said." Emma stood on the stage, her hands trembling at her sides. The weight of her family's disappointment crushed her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had dreamed of this moment, of proving herself, of making them see her worth, but instead, she felt smaller than ever. The murmurs of disapproval swirled around the hall like a storm, each whisper cutting into her like a blade. She should never have danced. She ruined the event. This was supposed to be Olivia's moment. Emma clenched her fists, fighting the sting of tears. She had done nothing wrong. She had worked hard. She had danced beautifully. Why couldn't they see that? Just as she was about to step off the stage, a voice cut through the noise. That was remarkable. The hall fell silent. Emma turned toward the back of the room, where the small group of strangers sat. The man in the suit, the one who had clapped first, stood up, his sharp eyes fixed on her. "Who is this young dancer?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Emma's heart pounded. She had no idea who he was, but the way people turned to look at him told her he was someone important. Her aunt frowned. "That's Emma, Olivia's younger sister." The man nodded thoughtfully. "Emma," he repeated, as if testing the name. Then he smiled. "You have talent." Emma blinked. Had she heard that right? Whispers spread through the crowd again, but this time they weren't filled with anger. They were filled with curiosity. Olivia stiffened in her seat. "She's just an amateur," she said quickly. "I was supposed to dance tonight." The man barely glanced at her, and yet she performed. He turned back to Emma. "You held the stage with confidence. You didn't just dance. You told a story." Emma's breath hitched. No one had ever said that to her before. The woman beside him smiled warmly. "We represent a ballet academy, a prestigious one. We're always looking for fresh talent." Emma's eyes widened. Was this really happening? The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, extending it toward her. "We'd like to invite you for an audition." Gasps echoed through the hall. Emma's mother covered her mouth in shock. Olivia's face paled. Emma stared at the card, her fingers shaking as she reached for it. This was everything she had ever wanted, an opportunity to prove herself, to dance for people who saw her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't standing in Olivia's shadow. She was standing in her own light. And for the first time, her family had nothing to say. Emma's body moved with grace, but inside, she felt hollow. Every step, every spin, every perfect landing, none of it seemed to matter. The silence from the audience was heavier than any mistake she could have made. She had imagined this moment so differently. She had hoped for gasps of admiration, for applause that filled the room, for her family to finally see her as more than just the girl in the background. Instead, all she saw were blank expressions. She caught a glimpse of Olivia, still sitting with her arms crossed, an almost amused look on her face. Her aunt whispered something to the person next to her, shaking her head in disappointment. Emma's uncle leaned back in his seat, unimpressed. Emma's heart clenched, but she didn't let it show. She kept moving, each step filled with a quiet defiance. If they weren't going to clap, if they weren't going to see her, then she would make them see her. She pushed harder, leaping higher, spinning faster. She danced not for them, but for herself. And then she heard something. A single clap. It was soft at first, but clear against the silence. Then another, and another. Emma's eyes darted toward the sound. It wasn't coming from her family. It was coming from the back of the hall. A small group of strangers sat there, watching her with real interest. One of them, a man in a suit with sharp eyes, nodded approvingly. He whispered something to the woman next to him, and she smiled. Emma didn't know who they were, but for the first time that night, she felt seen. She finished the routine with one last perfect spin, landing lightly on her toes. The music stopped. The performance was over. For a second, there was nothing but silence. Then, in the back of the hall, the small group started clapping. It wasn't the loud, thunderous applause Emma had dreamed of, but it was something. But her family, they remained still. And then someone in the front row muttered, "This is unacceptable." Emma's stomach dropped. The whispers grew louder. The looks of disapproval deepened. And that was when she realized some of them weren't just unimpressed. They were angry. The grand hall shimmered with golden lights, and the air buzzed with excitement. The entire family had gathered for the big event, dressed in their finest clothes, chatting and laughing as they waited for the performance to begin. The stage stood at the center, its polished wooden floor reflecting the glow of the chandeliers. It was the same stage where Olivia had danced many times before, earning endless praise and admiration. But tonight, Olivia wouldn't be the one performing. Tonight, it was Emma. Backstage, Emma's hands trembled as she adjusted the ribbons on her ballet shoes. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She peeked through the curtain, scanning the audience. Olivia sat in the front row, her injured foot resting on a small stool. Her expression was unreadable, but Emma could tell she wasn't happy. The rest of the family chatted casually, unaware of what was about to happen. A cold knot tightened in Emma's stomach. Would they laugh? Would they shake their heads in disappointment? She had practiced all night, but what if it wasn't enough? The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. And now, for tonight's performance, Emma will be taking the stage. Silence. Emma held her breath as she stepped onto the stage. Whispers rippled through the audience. Confused glances passed between family members. Emma, someone murmured. She's performing, another whispered. Emma swallowed hard, keeping her head high. The lights shone down on her, making it impossible to see their faces clearly. Maybe that was a good thing. In the front row, Olivia crossed her arms, her lips curling into a smirk. Emma didn't need to hear her words to know what she was thinking. This is going to be a disaster. The music started. A soft, haunting melody filled the air. Emma took a deep breath and raised her arms, stepping into her first move. For the first few seconds, she felt stiff, uncertain. The weight of every watching eye pressed down on her. But then, something shifted. The music wrapped around her like a familiar embrace, and her body responded instinctively. Step by step, movement by movement, she danced. The whispers died down. The audience grew silent. Emma spun gracefully, her skirt flowing around her. She leaped, landing softly, her feet barely making the sound. She stretched her arms, her body bending with perfect control. In the crowd, Olivia's smirk faded. Other family members leaned forward, their expressions unreadable. Emma pushed herself harder, her heart pounding with every beat of the music. She had dreamed of this moment, and now it was real. But just as she was about to reach the final turn, something unexpected happened. A sharp voice broke through the silence. "What is this?" Someone in the audience muttered. Emma's stomach twisted. The mood in the room shifted. The admiration she thought she saw in their eyes was gone. A cold, heavy feeling settled over the hall. She landed her final move with perfect precision, her breath uneven. But the applause she had hoped for never came. Instead, the audience sat frozen. And then, one by one, they started whispering again. But this time, the whispers weren't about surprise. They were about anger. "You said." Emma stood frozen on the stage, her breath uneven. The soft claps from the back of the hall had faded, swallowed by the heavy silence of her family's disappointment. She had given everything to this performance, poured her heart into every movement. But instead of pride, all she saw was resentment. Her aunt was the first to speak. She turned to Emma's mother, her voice sharp. "How could you allow this?" Emma's mother stiffened. "Allow what?" "This embarrassment." Olivia's mother snapped, motioning toward the stage. Emma had no right to take Olivia's place. The performance was supposed to be perfect. And now, she shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. Emma's face burned. Had no right. Was that what they thought? That she had stolen something that never belonged to her? Olivia let out a small, mocking laugh. "I told you, she wasn't ready." Emma clenched her fists. She had trained all night. She had performed flawlessly. How could they act like she had ruined everything? Her uncle sighed, rubbing his temple. The event was planned around Olivia. We should have postponed it. Emma should never have been put in this position. Emma's mother's eyes flashed with anger. She did her best, and she was brilliant. Her aunt scoffed. Brilliant? You call this brilliant? Look at everyone. They expected Olivia, and instead they got. She stopped short, but Emma knew exactly what she was about to say. They got her. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. She looked around the room, hoping to find at least one face that showed kindness, but all she saw were disapproving glances and whispered complaints. Even those who weren't openly upset avoided meeting her gaze. A wave of shame crashed over her. Had she been wrong to take this chance? The only ones who had clapped, the strangers in the back, watched the scene unfold with quiet interest. The man in the suit leaned over and whispered something to the woman beside him. Emma had no idea who they were, but somehow they felt like the only ones who saw her. Before she could dwell on it, Olivia stood up. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said coolly. "The performance is over. Let's just move on." But Emma wasn't sure she could. Her family wasn't just disappointed. They were furious. And worst of all, they weren't even hiding it.